The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe. It also destroyed everything that made medieval life worth living. And the reality was far more horrifying than any movie that we see on the black plate today. But before we descend into the nightmare world of bad plague, do subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. October 1347. Imagine living on a quiet autumn morning in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sun had a golden light across the harbor as fishermen hauled in their catch, and merchants were preparing for another day of Mediterranean trade. One fisherman looked up and spotted a sail on the horizon. It was a Genoese ship. It was a Genoese ship arriving from the east, probably carrying spices, silk, or other luxury goods. Because trade in that era was just starting, and at a much higher volume. The fisherman wiped his hand on the tunic, raised an arm, and waved at the people coming from the ship. However, the crazy part is that no one waved back. The ship then drifted towards the dock with a silence that was almost grim. People on the port were curious and slightly concerned. One of the fishermen still called out greetings as he climbed the cracked wooden stairs. However, what came next would haunt him the rest of his life. It was a smell that hit him. Thick, foul, unnatural, in the stench of death, and became mixed with something else. Something was wrong on a molecular level. He did not understand. There were bodies scattered across the whole deck as something bad had happened to them, but crazy enough, there were no bones. What people saw was that their skin was blackened and bloated. Others were barely moving, with their lymph nodes swollen to the level where it was like watching a horror movie. The fishermen went back in horror, scrambling off the ship and shouting warnings. However, it was too late. Those 12 Genoese people brought more than goods from the east. They were carrying death without knowing what was in them. Around 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa will die in what becomes known as the Black Death, which is the most devastating pandemic in human history. But life in these areas wasn't always like this. To understand the true horror of what was to come, we must understand what medieval Europe had achieved by 1340. This wasn't the dark ages of popular imagination, but rather a sophisticated, confident, and civilized civilization that was at its absolute peak. Europe's population had nearly tripled since the year 1000, reaching an estimated 75 million people. Great cities were thriving thanks to the trade routes that connected the continent. Paris had more than 200,000 inhabitants, which made it larger than any settlement Europe had had since the fall of Rome 1,000 years earlier. Gothic cathedrals were rising upwards, and we saw things like Notre Dame in Paris, Canterbury in England, and Cologne in Germany. These structures were so magnificent that even to this date, we humans have failed to build something as uniquely beautiful as that. Many people believe it was divine intervention alone that could explain this. It's a beauty that people from that era had achieved. Moreover, universities in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna attracted Europe's biggest minds. Thomas Aquinas had also recently created ancient Greek philosophy with Christian theology, which was quite interesting to see. Trade networks in that era connected Western Europe to the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. The same Silk Road that brought luxury goods also facilitated the exchange of ideas. Technology had a lot more. Medicine, astronomy, and mathematics were all at the peak of their advancement. But beneath this prosperity, there were also some vulnerabilities. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already demonstrated the fragility of human life and what climate change and agricultural failure could do to us. Cities were crowded. Sanitation was not the best, but modern standards and the very success of medieval civilization, which was a dense urban population, had a problem that no one saw coming. This was a civilization that had convinced itself that it possessed answers to life's greatest questions. Their confidence was at an all-time high, but they weren't ready for what was coming towards them. Dawn of the Death. While Europe was celebrating its golden age, something terrible was stirring in the vast steppes of Central Asia. It was in the mountains of what we call modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where death was evolving. Recent archaeological evidence has traced Black Death's origin to the Tian Shan mountain range, where ancient plague gnomes revealed the birthplace of humanity's most devastating pandemic. It was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis that mutated into a form that is far more violent to humans. This bacterium had been humanity's silent companion for millennia and was lurking in colonies of squirrels and other rodents that were scattered across Eurasia. But something changed around 1338. And scientists linked it to climate fluctuations. It got worse. And now this bacteria formed a mutation that made it perfect for its effect to get into human bloodstreams and thrive there. That's how the Black Plague was formed. It originated in China in the early to mid-1300s and spread across the trade routes westward, carried by merchants who had no idea what they were transporting. Yet, it was humanity's doom. The great trading city of Kaffa in the Crimea, which is modern-day Feodosia, became ground zero for Europe's encounter with the Black Death in 1346 during a siege of the city by Mongol forces. The plague struck the besieging army with devastating force. A lot of contemporary chronicles also report that they saw what seemed like mountains of dead, and they were thrown into the city, and Christians could not hide or flee from them. The Genoese merchants inside Kaffa, after witnessing the city's rapid descent into chaos, made a decision that sealed Europe's fate. They loaded their ships with whatever they could find and fled west across the Black Sea. And before we reveal how horrific the Black Flag was, please subscribe to the channel where we talk about history's greatest horrors. The Black Plague. After those 12 Genoese galleys went into Messina's harbor in October 1347, the townspeople and harbor master gathered to greet them, yet encountered a scene of nightmares. Most of the bodies were already dead and were sprawled across the deck. Those who were alive were barely recognizable as human beings, and their skin was blackened. The Sicilian authorities even recognized the danger, but they didn't understand its true nature and had no idea that it could travel from one person to another. They ordered the ship to leave immediately, probably believing that whatever afflicted the sailor wouldn't spread if the ship departed. But little did they know it was too late because the plague had already found its step in Europe. The Black Death then went on to kill 1/3 of Europe's population, with more than 25 million people dying between 1,347 and 1,352. These are just 5 years, and recent scholarship also suggests that the toll may have been even higher. In some regions, mortality approached 60%. Paris was one of the greatest cities of the world, and it became a charnel house. The population fell from 200,000 to fewer than 100,000, and the bodies were piling up faster than they could be buried. Traditional funeral rites collapsed entirely, and the dead were thrown into mass graves. Florence also witnessed something similar. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived to ride the Decameron, provided one of the most interesting writings, saying how many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfasted with their kinfolk, and that same night supped with their ancestors. In the next world, the reality was that thousands of children who survived the initial wave were orphaned in a world that had forgotten how to care for the living because it was overwhelmed by caring for the dead. Even the medieval physicians who were trained in classical traditions found themselves completely useless. Their carefully constructed understanding of disease also crumbled after they encountered the Black Plague. The plague manifested in 3 main forms, and each was more terrifying than the other. First was the Bubonic plague, and the most common one, which was introduced through buboes. It was a swollen lymph node that could grow to the size of an orange, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. The swelling appeared suddenly, and it was as hard as stone, burning with fever. When they burst, the stench filled the room, and death followed within days. The second one was the Pneumonic plague that attacked the lungs directly, causing victims to cough up blood and die within hours of showing symptoms. However, the most feared of them all was the Septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. Victims often died within hours and showed few external symptoms beyond its characteristics. A characteristic blackening of the body, which is why it is also called the Black Death. Doctors of that era tried everything. They prescribed complex herbal mixtures, performed bloodletting to balance the body's humors, burned aromatic substances to purify the corrupted air. Some recommended drinking your own urine, while others suggested crushing a marbled or powdered unicorn horn. These seem absurd to us, but back in medieval medical knowledge, these were all quite decent cures. However, the irony of that knowledge was that it didn't work. The failure to establish medicine created a crisis that was extended far beyond medical practices. Destruction of human bonds. But even more horrifying than physical symptoms was what the plague did to human relationships. The fundamental bond of having a family is the same. We have parent and child, husband and wife, friend and friend. But it all dissolved under the pressure of this utter terror. Brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife forsook brother. These are the words of Boccaccio, who recorded the unthinkable. This wasn't just cowardice, but it was a complete breakdown of how serious the plague was and what it did to regular relationships. Priests refused to administer last rites, the single most important spiritual service in medieval Christianity. There were strange phenomena accompanied by the plague's passage. Witnesses also reported seeing mysterious figures in white robes walking through the cities at night, marking doors with crosses to indicate the future victims. A lot of people say that this was death itself. But when you're on the brink of death, you tend to see a lot of crazy things. The psychological terror of waiting for death while watching everyone around you die created trauma that survivors carried the rest of their lives. A lot of people concluded that humanity itself has grown so corrupt that God decided to start over, just like he did with Noah's flood. So they were looking for scapegoats. And European Jews, who were already marginalized, found themselves blamed through these conspiracy theories. Despite the obvious fact that Jews died from plague at the same rate as Christians, rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or made pacts with the devil. Entire Jewish communities were buried alive in Germany and France, with their property seized by local authorities. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned a day. In the end, it was all about what happens when we, as humans, encounter something completely random that we have no control over. We tend to play blame games, we tend to find scapegoats, and we also tend to act unreasonably, with no logic but purely based on emotions. How do you think the world would respond if a plague like the Black Plague started today? Tell us in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell icon for more.